Yeah. But the bottom line, if you look at that, that's a fairly straightforward. You just by positioning the force there, now Kiev is isolated.
Well, it's somewhat ironic, but several times on Polish television, in news programs, they put up maps of a post-war settlement in which the little bit of Ukraine that
Western
is
Ukraine. Yeah.
Hungarian would go back to Hungary, the little bit that's Romanian would go back to Romania, and then there are three oblasts,
Yeah.
which were once part of Poland until not so very long ago.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, you might have a kind of complicity
Hmm.
between Poland and Russia, and what would be left then between the area, the oblasts around Lviv, would be a rump state of Ukraine, serving as a buffer, and then Russia proper.
Well, see, the nice thing about going to Zhytomyr and then down to Vinnytsia
Yeah, yeah,
is that you are not confronting a Polish military contingent.
that's true.
And if we are stupid enough to commit 30 or 40,000 U.S. troops
Yeah,
50 or 60 kilometers into Western Ukraine, if they sort of take that line, then they could conceivably avoid confronting us.
that's true.
I'm hopeful that we will not do that because I would think that someone would not want to bankroll or back up Polish annexation of territory or anybody else's annexations. I mean, it's beginning to sound like Czechoslovakia in 1938.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it is on people's mind, though,
Oh, of
and
course.
and so what to me, what these little ironical admissions suggest or signal is that, uh, in spite of all the rhetoric, the political rhetoric that is pushed
Hmm.
out there, that elites are thinking seriously about a post-war settlement that does not involve the status quo ante for Ukraine, to say the least.
Well, I think it also creates the possibility that whatever settlement emerges will not include Washington.
That's true, and that's another story.
And to be frank, Washington would be smart to stay out of it. Whether or not we're smart enough to do that, I don't know. But anything that can occur without us and it offers stability in some form is probably desirable. And I'm sure from the Russian vantage point, they would be less concerned about the Polish presence provided it did not symbolize an aggressive NATO
A
presence.
stalking horse for the U.S., in
Yes,
other words.
and no U.S. missiles and
Right.
so forth, so on. Now, that, of course, is a huge assumption given the Polish attitudes, which are frankly dangerous.
Well, unfortunately, I agree there. Now, just to finish out this first part, there are a series of issues that speak to profound misconceptions that Americans have about the conduct of war and operational art. And I just
Mhm.
thought we might visit those quickly so that those watching might understand better what is actually going on. In other words, the actual dynamic of battle and the actual way in which the Russians have been performing and succeeding. And the first of those has to do with fortification. And it seems as though the assumption is that Russians cannot break through the intense fortifications that the U.S. and NATO helped the Ukrainians construct over 8 years. And they're fairly extensive. They look like the height
Mhm.
of a trench development, pillbox, etc., development in World War I. But the assumption is that the Russians are taking horrendous losses trying to take them, and the the issue, it seems to me, is that Americans don't seem to understand that fortifications can delay an offensive, but they can't stop an offensive. Maybe you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, this is something that came up early on. I think we have a very light infantry centric leadership
Yeah,
in NATO
that's important.
because of the last 20 years
Hmm.
of light infantry operations against very weak insurgents. The British fall into this category naturally, given their imperial past.
Yes,
The French also, although the French, to their credit, I think have largely stayed out of this, at
right.
least in physical terms on the ground. I think the idea of a fortification is appealing because there's an assumption that if you place forces inside a city, everyone has to stop to remove them. But
Right.
in reality, the opposite is the case. If you are kind enough to immobilize yourself, the enemy is probably going to respect your decision to immobilize yourself and will, eagerly
Yeah,
surround you, cut off your water, cut off your
right.
food, whatever sustenance. You will run out of ammunition, and then you have a choice. You can either surrender or be annihilated, while the main body of the force moves on to other locations. This was the sort of Hitlerian approach in World War
Right,
II. Let's
right.
have fortified places, and the Soviet armies will have to stop. No, Soviet armies didn't stop.
That shows at the end of the war in Kurland, for example. You had
Sure.
a whole German army just uselessly boxed in.
Yeah. So I think this is a huge problem for us because it undermines all our assumptions about
Yeah,
how we want to fight in the future. Second thing is, you know, we think we found a new technology that will destroy tanks. Well, you've got lots of technologies and have always had them to destroy
oh,
tanks.
totally.
It's like minefields. We've always had minefields, millions of mines all over Eastern Europe during World War II, North Africa. It's not a new phenomenon.
Tank begat anti-tank
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
immediately.
of
So,
course.
yeah,
But what people learn to do is to partner these capabilities with other capabilities that are designed to protect them or enhance them.
right,
And so you may see a change in the balance. Instead of 100 tanks, there may only be 50 in the future and more of something else.
right.
But the bottom line is that you end up with a different construct that's designed to exploit that strike capability thanks to ISR. So instead of sitting and waiting for something to happen, you are now moving through the ISR strike
Right.
environment.
Well, this is what has struck me so much about the war in Donbass, where you have this World War One like buildup of fortification, and how essentially passive the Ukrainians have
Hmm.
been. Or if they're not passive, they're like little attacks in World War One. They're suicidal.
Well, they started with very large scale counteroffensives, 50, 60,000 troops.
Yes.
They've been cut down to company size
Right.
elements, relentlessly being hurled against these defenses, which again, as we pointed out, is the Russians have welcomed this, but it is being detrimental to the Ukrainian war effort.
Well, the corollary to talking about fortification, thus, is to talk about fires.
Hmm.
And Americans have a completely cartoon like understanding
Hmm.
from the Soviet days, but also just in their head that somehow Russian fires are massive but indiscriminate, and because they can't be precisely or promptly targeted, are not achieving their goals. And I just would like you to clear up the Russian approach to and success with fires in this war.
The first thing we have to understand is the monopoly on the microcircuitry
Hmm.
that was essential to precision
Right.
that we enjoyed in 1991 is
We did.
gone.
Right.
As soon after the turn of the century, that microcircuitry found its way into Russia and China and elsewhere. The Russians, the Chinese, and anybody that cares to buy their equipment, obviously, now has the ability to attack precisely any point that they can identify, provided they have the range with a weapon system.
Yep.
So the Russians now have the ability to deliver accurate, devastating firepower with enormous precision
Yeah.
to the point that immobilizing yourself or sitting still for any great length of time is very dangerous. Now, if you can disappear under 20 feet of concrete or something temporarily, you may survive for a while,
Right.
but it's not a long term solution. The only long term solution is some degree of protected mobility, integrated air defenses, and the Russians have demonstrated that their integrated air defenses have been marvelously effective, shooting down things like HIMARS missiles,
Yes.
which we didn't expect.